Okay, we begin this week in Genesis 27. As you know, you've heard me talk about this story before. Genesis 27, one of my very favorite stories in the Bible. And it's my favorite, it's one of my favorites because I think it says a lot. It is a masterfully told story. The author, the teller of this story, is very careful to draw a lot of threads together in a neat bow. And you probably know too that I interpret this a little bit different than most people. Now I'm following other people. My Hebrew professor in seminary, I've got the basic interpretation of this story from him, and I've taken possession of it and added my own touches to it over the year. But I think in general, this is one of those stories like we saw in the book of Judges that people really don't know exactly what to do with. And I think for that reason, they often maybe pick the wrong hero in the story and they don't see things clearly. So let's dive into this and we'll bring all that out as we go through. It starts out in verse 1. Now it came to pass when Isaac was old and his eyes were so dim that he could not see that he called Esau, his older son, and said to him, "My son." And Esau answered him, "Here am I." So a formal greeting back to him. But a couple things. Let me say at the beginning, this is a story, so we got to watch the storytelling techniques that he's using. And as I said, he's very careful to bring out things. And so what he is doing in this first verse, I think, is laying down breadcrumbs so we can follow him along. I think we are already getting hints and clues about Isaac in this first verse. Let me point those out. So wait a minute. Hit the brakes. There are clues in this that something's not right. Did you see any clues as we went through that? Well, they're very subtle clues, but I think they do add up. First, it said Isaac was old. Now, I don't know if this was intended to be a clue or not. It's not bad to be old, but I have noticed something as I have studied the Bible over the years, that in the Old Testament, there is an ongoing thread that when these leaders get old, they begin to lose effectiveness as a leader. And I'll come back to that. Let me list out some of the first several clues, and then I'll come back and talk a little more about them. He could not see. And I think that word see goes back to, and the Lord saw it was good. God has vision to see. God knows the truth. God knows what should be done and what should not be done. And to be able to see things clearly is to see things as God sees them. It's the same thing for us. As we go through our life, we are to view people and events. We are supposed to see them the way God sees them. And so I think that being dim in vision is a clue that Isaac is seeing his own way here and not looking for God's way.
They didn't have cataract surgery back then.
They did. They did. As far as we know. And he called Esau his older son, but he didn't call Jacob. He didn't call everybody in. And I'll show you in a little bit as we get down through the verses that the norm, as you get to the end of your life, is to call all the sons in. And there's a transparency about that. And you pass out the blessings, you pass out the portions of your wealth and your name out in front of everybody. But Isaac is calling for a secret meeting. And so I think these little specks are clues of things. Let's talk a little bit more about it. Moses, I've observed that Moses, up through Mount Sinai, is a great and bold leader. He is the lawgiver, and he is the one who faces Pharaoh, the most powerful person in the world. He says, "Let my people go." He leads them out. An unthinkable thing. They were slaves. He faced the most powerful military in the world with no military of his own. brave and bold up till Mount Sinai. And then you look at Moses after Mount Sinai, and everything he does is weak.
Esau was probably a more likable person.
I think it's
than
clear.
Jacob,
Yeah.
because Jacob was a mama's boy.
I think it's pretty clear in the story that Esau's more manly. He's more the one that a father would dote on, and I think that's a story element. I think you are thinking exactly what the author wants you to. But do we always see God's will in people's personality? Have you known preachers where one was just a joy to be around, and he was funny, and he was good looking, and you just want to believe everything he said, and then you find out one day that he's not got that much character, and then you have another one that's rather dry, not that interesting, but after years you realize he's a really good man. He don't make bold claims, but he backs up everything he says. And so what you look like on the outside, personality, everything, is not an indication of your heart and how much you value God's will. Now, I don't know how much that applies here. I'm going to be critical of Jacob as we go through the rest of this book, so I'll warn you, I'm not a big Jacob fan. I don't think the author means for us to like Jacob. I think between the two, if we're picking on personality, Esau is a much more likable person, a much more straight up person than Jacob. It just happens God picked Jacob. And that is the cornerstone of this story. Jacob was God's chosen seed bearer. So Moses, you think about Moses when they were camped in Moab and they began bringing in the Moabite women, and the one fella took a Moabite girl in front of the elders and took her in his tent. And it says Moses stood with the elders and wrung his hands and wept by the tent of meeting. And then Phinehas grabbed a spear and went and took care of business. That is the picture of Moses after Mount Sinai. He's weak. He's old. King David. Is there anybody that's tougher or braver in the whole Bible than David? I don't think so. But when he got old, what did he do? He sent his men out to war. He stayed on the roof. And he just would wring his hands, and all he did was weep and snivel and things and send people to take care of business for him. Even King David. So I think Isaac being old is a hint that he's has less energy to faithfully serve God. Cannot see, as I said, from chapter 1, and God saw that it was good. To be able to see is to understand things as God, and he could not. Things were dim to him, and I think that's a clue. And then he called in one son, and he should have called in everybody. So here's the normal procedure. We see, if we go back to 25, it said before Abraham died, he gave gifts to the sons of his concubines and sent them off to the lands in the east away from Isaac. Now, he gave Isaac the name and main portion of what he has, but this verse has a sense of transparency, and he made sure that each one knew their portion. But he also knew God's will, that Isaac was the chosen seed bearer, the son of promise, and so he wanted to separate the other sons from him so they would not try to take the blessing of the seed from him. If we went all the way to the end of the book, in Genesis 49:1, then Jacob called together all his sons. Gather around me, and I'll tell you what will happen to each of you in the days to come. He gave blessings to some, and to several he gave curses. But it was out in the open, that nobody had to guess where they stood. This is the normal procedure with a patriarch, with a father, to call in all the sons. So calling only one son, I think, is a clue that Isaac is being underhanded. Isaac is following his own plan. He's not doing things God's way. I think these things are very important in understanding and interpreting this story. Then he said to Esau, Behold, now I am old, and I do not know the day of my death. I think that is yet another clue. I don't know when I'm going to die. So those were the ones we've already talked about. Do not know the day of my death. Why is that a clue? Well, if you go to Genesis 48:21, then Jacob said to Joseph, Look, I'm about to die. How did he know he was about to die? I think the implication is because he was in touch with God. But God will be with you and will take you back to the land of Canaan, the land of your ancestors. So, because I'm in touch with God, I'm aware of when I'm going to die, and my concern is that you are in relationship with God, that you are back in the land following God's plan. Is that Isaac's concern? Jacob changed. Yeah, we'll get into Jacob. The thing about Jacob is do as Jacob says, not as Jacob do. Because Jacob is a scallywag, but he says a lot of good things. And he's very interesting. We'll pick him apart. Genesis 50, verse 24. Soon I will die, Joseph told his brothers. Again, because he's in touch with God, Joseph knows the day of his death. Isaac doesn't know. Which says, I'm not looking to God for guidance. I'm doing my own thing. I don't know when I'm going to die. I want to make sure before it happens that I get my plan done. But God will surely come and help you and lead you out of the land of Egypt. He will bring you back to the land He solemnly promised to give Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. So there's a concern. I'm about to die. I have a concern for God's will, and I make a connection with the land. The land. The land. The promised land. We've been talking about the land in Genesis a lot. So by contrast, Isaac did not know when he would die, but rather than wait until the proper time when God said you're about to die, he is favoring Esau early. Early. So again, let's add up the things. Don't know the day of death. And fifth, he did not mention anything about the land and God's will and God's plan. What is Isaac's concern? So he called in one son, didn't know when he was going to die. Is he concerned about the land? Is he even concerned about the inheritance? No, he says, now therefore, please take your weapons and your quiver and your bow and go out to the field and hunt some game for me. Do what? This is a clue. This is the way a storyteller tells you that Isaac, he may be telling us that Isaac is senile. But Isaac is not concerned about the Lord's plan. Has Isaac mentioned the Lord? Where did Isaac get his possessions that he's going to bless with? He got them from the Lord. There's a metaphor going on. This is an old metaphor about the stomach or about food, about eating. Let's look at that. So again, let's go back through these clues. Don't know. No concern about the land inheritance. It is that food or hunger metaphor for sin. How do we know these characters are out of God's will and sinning? They put their stomach ahead of very important things. And that is the way sin is. We say it all the time. When people are completely living away from God, God is not on the plate, God is not in concern, they get into all kind of trouble. And they live their life stomping out little fires all the time. Everything's an emergency. They jump from one crisis to the next. And we all know these people. Everything's a crisis. You can't talk to them. They're running like crazy to fix something. So everything's in a catastrophe. My sister's boyfriend punched her. And he was drunk. And she was drunk. And whatever. I mean, I'm testifying about my being a pastor out in the desert, I think. Anyway. Food hunger metaphor. And it goes on in verse 4. He says, and after you do go hunt, Make me something to eat. Make me a savory food, such as I love, and bring it to me that I may eat, that my soul may bless you before I die. Don't you think a blessing is an important thing? This is a significant blessing. This is the blessing. Basically, this is Jesus. This is, I'm going to pass you as the bearer of the seed to be, so that all the world may be blessed through us, through Jesus. But first, go get me something to run down to Burger King, and you know that 2 Whoppers for 10 deal? Bring that to yo man so that I may eat. Okay, so that's silly. I mean, that's preposterous, isn't it? But we're supposed to think, what are you talking about, Isaac? Remember back, a quick connection with Esau. Esau's playing in this. Remember Esau? Back in chapter 25, verse 29, Jacob was cooking some stew. Esau arrived home from the wilderness. He had been out hunting. So it's kind of a flip-flop of the story we're in. That's irony. Hebrews love irony. He comes back. He's exhausted and hungry. Hungry, angry, lonely, tired. Esau said, I am starved. Give me some of that red stew. Now it tells us that that's where he gets his other name. Edom is red. The word red. The word Edom means red in Hebrew. And it's double wordplay because right here the red stew, but also I believe it says that he had red hair too. And so his nickname was Red. So Esau's nickname was Red. And his descendants were the Edomites. And the Edomites, by the time the Bible was being compiled, are bitter enemies, generally, of the Hebrew people. Except sometimes they're allies and then they're enemies. So anyway, bring me some red stew. What good is my birthright to me now when I'm this hungry? And again, we're like, how can you compare one meal to your entire birthright? And that would be the double portion of the inheritance. He would carry the name of the family. He gave all that away in order to have one meal. And that is a metaphor for the way we prioritize sin over the things that are really important. How could people treat their family the way that some people do? Because it's sin. And they're willing to trade the most important things for cheap nothings. Okay?
When Samuel anointed David king, the Edomites and the Israelites were bitter enemies.
Yes. Most of the history of the kings, the monarchy.
That's the reason that he didn't bring David there. He was ashamed of it.
Yeah.
Because he was redheaded.
Yeah, well, I hadn't thought about that, but yeah, that's a possibility. Yeah.
The Bible says he was redheaded.
Yeah, it does. So, yeah, and so Edom, and that's an important, another thing that kind of gets lost on us. A big part of storytelling, as we've seen, is making connections. And so part of the purpose of this story is to make a connection for the hearers. This story is being told and written down hundreds of years after it happened. And after it's been told for a long time. And part of the purpose of that is to explain these Edomites that we're at war with. Why are they so mean to us? Well, it goes back to their ancestor, Esau. He made bad choices, and that's why they're mean to us. All right, so let's go back. Where do we get to, I say, an eating hunger metaphor? Well, let's go right back to the original sin. Chapter 3, verses 2 through 12, and I make a lot of gaps in here so I could fit it all on here. She is in conversation with the serpent, the tempter, the adversary, who is trying to talk her into disobeying God. She said, we may eat from all the trees of the garden, only the fruit from the tree in the middle of the garden that we are not allowed to eat. Okay? What we eat, if we could rank sins, what we eat is a minor sin, right? For us it's minor, but anything that comes between us and God. But that they have chosen hunger and eating as the main metaphor for sin in the Pentateuch. She was convinced. A little bit later, the serpent kept talking. She was convinced, so she took some fruit and she ate it in disobedience. Severed the relationship between God and man. Then she gave some to her husband. He ate it too. The man and the wife, a little bit later, heard God walking in the garden. They were hidden. Have you eaten? God says, have you eaten from the tree whose fruit I commanded you do not eat? The man replied, it was the woman, and notice he said, that you gave me. She gave me the fruit, and I ate it. You notice that Adam passes responsibility back to God and to the woman. He is the father of us all, isn't he? So consequences. After they sin, God gives out consequences. And he says to the man, and notice the eating metaphor for describing life severed from God. Life in a broken world. The human condition is described using food here. Since you listened to your wife and ate from the tree whose fruit I commanded you, do not eat. The ground is cursed because of you. Now the ground, remember the ground and the man. You remember the connection? Ground is Adamah and man is Adam. All right? So there are variations of the same word, and that is mean. We are made in God's image. The relationship between the man and the ground gives us life by giving us food. It provides for us. That is a metaphor for our relationship with God. So there's a double metaphor here. You eat, now the ground, our relationship between God and man is cursed because of your decision. All your life you will struggle to scratch a living out. Even though God has provided everything for you, you're going to have hardship because you have chosen to disobey God. It will grow, the ground rather will grow thorns and thistles for you, though you will eat of its grains. You will survive by it. Still, even in a sinful condition, God gives us life. But we have to scratch for a relationship with Him. By the sweat of your brow you shall have food to eat until you return to the ground from which you were made. For you were made from dust, and to dust you will return. Eating metaphor. So let's move on. So those were the initial clues that everything's not right with Isaac. Let's look at Rebekah a little bit. Now Rebekah was listening when Isaac spoke to Esau, his son, and Esau went to the field to hunt game and bring it. So by contrast, Rebekah was listening. I think that is very important in a description of Rebekah. Could Isaac view things from God's perspective? Did he see things? No. His eyes were dim. Did he have the energy to honor God? No, he was old and weak. He had a favored son. That's what he was concerned about. Was he most concerned about doing the right thing? No, he was really hungry. He was hungry, and that was his more urgent need. But Rebekah was listening. Rebekah knew what was going on. Remember, Genesis 25:22. The two children struggled within Rebekah's womb, so she went to ask Yahweh about it. All right? Is there a difference so far in what we've heard between Rebekah's approach to life and Isaac's? When she had a struggle, what did she do? She went to God. Why is this happening to me, Lord? She asked. Yahweh told her, the sons in your womb will become two nations. From the very beginning, the two nations will be rival. One nation will be stronger than the other, and your older son will serve your younger son. What does that mean? The line of descendancy, the promised seed, the blessing of Abraham, the promised child is Jacob, not Esau. So this is in chapter 25. We're over in chapter 27 now.
She knew that.
She knew that.
Yeah. She took things in her own hands just like Abraham and Sarah did.
Well,
I wonder if that was God's plan or it would have happened to him if it was.
to a certain extent, I think always, there's no perfect people in the Bible. Everybody has a flaw, just like human beings, right? I think, and I'll talk as we go through, I don't think that she is held to task for taking matters in her own hands as I read this. And the reason I think it's storytelling technique. This story, the author goes out of his way, the teller of this story goes out of his way to make it suspenseful, to make it interesting, to make the characters kind of spark and do interesting things. And I'll talk about this in a minute, but one of the major ways to see God in a story where God is not actively participating is to look at who's in power in the story. How much power does Rebekah have? So there are four characters. There is the father, and there are the two sons, and then there is the wife. Knowing what we know about ancient culture, being a very patriarchal society, meaning father-oriented society, who is the least powerful person in this story? I think it's the mother. And so, in storytelling, and it's still true, what makes a story really good to us? Well, when there's a powerful bad guy, and there's no way the bad guy set everything up so that they're going to steal all the money and they're going to do whatever. And there is a good guy, but the good guy is weak. And the good guy or good gal ends up in the end beating the bad guy. And we love stories like that. So that's a storytelling technique. But when they would tell that in stories involving a deity, what you would say is that is where the deity has to intervene. There is no way that Rebekah beats Isaac when it comes to power. She used trickery, but that was because Isaac was so much more powerful than her in this story. I think, and I've said it before, I believe the people at the time hearing this story would say, Rebekah is a very clever woman. Rebekah knew God's will. Isaac was doing his own thing. Does the family, in the end of the story, does the family end up doing God's will or doing it Daddy's way? They end up doing God's will. Why? Because the woman who knows God's will intervenes. Could she go in there and say, Isaac, I'm going to slap your jaws. You know good and well that Jacob is supposed to be the one you trying to give a blessing to Esau. No. In ancient times, he could have her throat cut for that. And everybody would say, you did right. You can't have a woman, acting that way to you. Now, we don't think that way. That's one reason these stories are difficult. And that's one reason people always say, well, naughty, naughty Rebekah, she's deceiving. But it turns out good anyway. So they acted bad, but it turned out good. I don't think that's the way the ancient people heard the story. I think that is a modern take on an ancient story. I think when we see Isaac is so much more powerful than Rebekah, she had to use deception. I'd say the same thing. If you remember all those stories when we were back in the book of Judges, almost every story, there was this huge power differential. And it usually was the Israelites were weak and Moabite or somebody was strong. And the best example is Jael and Sisera. Sisera comes in, he's the most powerful warrior in the land period. good or bad. Nobody can stand up to Sisera. He's a powerful one. And so he goes into the tent with a little fragile Jael. And what does she do? What does she have? How can she overcome this powerful warrior? And this warrior who is a danger to Israel's existence. Well, what does she do? She says, come on in here, big boy. Lay down. Take your little nap. She rubs his back. He goes to bed. She drives a spike through his head.
If you read through the book of Kings, you'll find if the mother of the king was an Israelite, that was a good king. If the mother of the king was a pagan one, it was a bad king.
Yeah. And we hear Israelite and pagan. Modern people hear that, and they think, oh, well, that story is jilted towards Israelite race. No, what would be our equivalent is if the mother was a woman of faith and she taught her children to have faith in God, then they were good kings. And if it was a woman that led her son in the ways of the world, then that king would lead the people in the ways of the world, and he was a bad king. Okay? And so you have to take those essential truths, understand them in that time, the way it was told in that time, and then speak the essential truth in a way that modern people can hear. And that's a big problem. And this story is a classic example. So the point here is that Rebekah was listening. She knew what was God's will. And she knew right away. What was she thinking when she heard Isaac talking to Esau as it concerns God's will? What'd she know, John?
That he was going to derail the plan.
He was going to derail the plan. Now, step back from the story. Esau had already married pagan women. We done know that. So he gets the blessing. We don't do blessings anymore. We don't know the significance. But that's saying human choice plays a part in God's will. In other words, we can gum up God's will in our life, and God won't be able to use us. Does we still agree with that? Can I make a choice? Could I make a choice this afternoon that would disqualify me to be y'all's pastor? Absolutely. And so it's not so much, does that mean I'm shutting God down? He's not going to do what he was going to do through me? No. That means I make myself unusable. Now, and so we don't use blessing, but that's what it's saying. Esau is unusable. So if the blessing is given to Esau, then that's a dead end with this family. God has to start over. And so she knows that. When she hears him say, I'm going to give the blessing to you, the kingly blessing, the line of descent, the line of the seed, I'm going to put it to you, though you're already married to pagan women. And the women are, as Faye has already pointed out, the women are the most influential for spiritual things in the stories. And so are pagan women going to influence us to follow Yahweh or to follow the God of the Ammonites, the God of the Hittites, whatever? Yeah, they're going to take us away from Yahweh. And so is Jesus going to be born to a pagan person? So is this a big story for us? Rebekah is a hero of our faith. Isaac is in the same way that Abraham was giving Sarah to Pharaoh. She could not. The seed came through Abraham, not through Pharaoh. The seed came through Abraham, not through Abimelech. In the same way, men were making choices to disqualify them from the promises of God and being useful to God. Isaac is doing the same thing again. And Rebekah hears it, and she knows he is not doing right. That is the central interpretive truth of this story. You have to read everything she does after this in light of, she is the one that knows if the seed goes to Esau, this is the dead end. it's got to go to Jacob. What's her options once she knows that? What's her options? Can she run in there and get Isaac in a headlock? No. And we don't understand today. We are, the way we treat, we are so egalitarian as compared to the way the Bible was. She did not have the power to do anything but to try to fix things without Isaac knowing. So Rebekah, let's look at several points about Rebekah. She knew that Isaac was going against God's will. She could not openly oppose her husband in that culture. She could not tell him no. She could not embarrass him publicly. All these things were death sentences to her. There was, as I said, a severe power differential between man and wife in those days that we disconnect from. We don't understand. Do wives ever deceive their husbands? Sure, they all do. And husbands deceive their wives. Hopefully not on major things. But this is a different game. We try to reduce this to house politics at our house. But this is not. This is life and death. Who are you going to pick, Rebekah? Are you going to pick God? Are you going to pick your husband? And if you pick God, how are you going to do it? How are you going to follow God? So Rebekah spoke to her son Jacob, saying, "Indeed, I heard your father speak to Esau, your brother, saying, 'Bring me game, make savory food for me, that I may eat it and bless you in the presence of the day of the Lord before my death.' Now therefore, my son, obey my voice according to what I command you. Go now to the flock and bring me from there 2 choice kids of the goats. I'll make a savory food for them, such as your father loves. Then you shall take it to your father, that he may eat it, that he may bless you before his death." And Jacob said to Rebekah his mother, "Look, Esau my brother's hairy man, and I am smooth-skinned man. Perhaps father will feel me, touch me, and I shall seem to be a deceiver." Now I'm unhappy with that New King James, Old King James, and I think the NASB choose deceiver there. I don't like that because Jacob's name is deceiver, is close to the word deceiver. But that is not the Hebrew word that's used there. The word here is to act up or to mock. And so mocker is a lot closer to what I think it says. And the reason I say that is because that word deceiver is important later in the story connecting with Jacob. But here it says that I'll seem to be mocking him, disrespectful, that I'll be breaking custom. And I shall bring a curse on myself and not a blessing. But his mother said to him, and again, I take this as a statement of Rebekah's character. This is motherly concern. And again, following this plan is an attempt on her part to do God's will, to bring about God's will. She is opposing the enemy of God, or someone who is opposing God. She said, but his mother said, if there's a curse to be passed out, let your curse be on me, my son. Only obey my voice and go and get them for me. Verse 14, he went and got them and brought them to his mother, and his mother made savory food such as the father loved. Then Rebekah took the choice clothes of her eldest son Esau, which were with her in her house, and put them on Jacob, her younger son. And she put the skins of the kids of the goats on his hands and the smooth part of his neck. And then she gave the savory food and the bread which she had prepared to the hand of her son Jacob. Verse 18, so he went to his father, and he said, my father, And he said, "Here I am. Who are you, my son?" And as this story is being told, Isaac is smelling a rat here right away. Jacob said to his father, "I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done just as you told me. Please arise and sit and eat of my game, that your soul may bless me." Verse 20, but Isaac said to his son, "How is it that you found it so quickly, my son?" And he said, "Because Yahweh, your God, has brought it to me." Now, on the level of the story, that seems like deceit. But from our view, reading what has come before, knowing that God has told Rebekah that Jacob is the one, this verse has more clout, or that statement has more clout. Because Yahweh your God brought it to me. Yahweh your God is working a plan through me. Isaac said to Jacob, "Please come near that I may feel you, my son, whether you are really my son Esau or not." Is Isaac feeling conviction from the Lord right here?
He smells the rat.
Well, is that the same thing as conviction? No. I say he smells a rat because he is determined to do his way. And he doesn't care. I assume that Isaac knows that the younger shall serve, that the older shall serve the younger. He may not. But I assume that Rebekah would have told him, and that is even more willful. And this is rather than let Isaac off the hook, this is driving home the point. Isaac is determined to favor the older son. That's his plan. He's sticking to it. Verse 22, so Jacob went near to Isaac his father, and he felt him and said, "The voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are the hands of Esau." And he did not recognize him because his hands were hairy like his brother Esau's hands. So Isaac blessed him. Has God's will been done? Yes. All right. This is an interesting story that he stretches out the suspense. He adds twists and turns in the story to make it interesting. It's a masterful story. But what is the point? Well, there is a relation, and there is an underlying theme. Yes, that Jacob does turn out to be kind of a deceiver. So that is a part of the story. But in the end, what is the book of Genesis about? Is it about learning quirkiness about different biblical characters? No. The point of Genesis is man falls. Man was created by God to know God and walk with God. Man turns his back on God. God begins a plan immediately in chapter 3 to recover that blessing and to reconnect with mankind. And so, for the blessing, so he blessed him, God's will be done. That is the power and the theme in this story. And so the human characters are secondary in importance. But from God's perspective, the ones that are carrying out his will are the ones that are following him. Then he said, "Are you really my son Esau?" Well, Jacob says, "I am." And he said, "Bring it near to me, and I will eat of my son's game so that my soul may bless you." So he brought it near him, and he ate, and he brought him wine, and he drank. Again, there's the wine drinking. I didn't pick up on that earlier, but with Noah and Lot, that was a factor in sinning. Then his father Isaac said to him, "Come now near and kiss me, my son." And he came near and he kissed him, and he smelled the smell of his clothing, and he blessed him, and he said, "Surely the smell of my son is like the smell of the field, which Yahweh has blessed. Therefore, may God give you the dew of the heaven," this is the blessing, "and of the fatness of the earth, and the plenty of grain and wine. Let people serve you, and nations bow down to you. Be master over your brethren, and let your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be those who bless you. Now that last part, is that familiar? That is the blessing of Abraham. What is interesting, this stuff right above it, be master over your brethren, that's a new addition to an old blessing. We've seen that blessing repeatedly. So master over your brethren, let your mother's son bow down to you. This is new. It points to Abraham's blessing, but that new addition, be master over your brothers, that's very similar to, we will see in Genesis 49, when Jacob calls together all the sons and passes out blessings and curses. We would expect that the main blessing goes to the oldest son, but it does not. Then we would say the second one and the third one, and it does not. We get down to the fourth son, Judah, and he says, Judah, your brothers will praise you. You will grasp your enemies by the neck. All your relatives will bow before you. What is the significance of the blessing to Judah? Any significance? That is the blessing of the seed. So that connection in chapter 27, when he blesses Jacob, ties him to Judah in 49. Does anybody remember what tribe Jesus is from? He is from the tribe of Judah, and we shorten that to he is a Jew. Remember the big theme? We've already talked about it. The seed. Faye got it right. So here's the important point. This story, taken in isolation, if you just heard this story, you'd have a very different interpretation of the meaning. You know what you'd focus on? Trickery, suspense, ambition, daring, risk-taking, deception, favoritism, favored son by the father, favored son by the mother. And that really, which is a classic type in storytelling, a way that stories kind of develop, daddy's favorite, mama's favorite. That's the way you hear this told most of the time. That's a human conflict. But what does daddy's favorite versus mama's favorite with playing tricks to get their way, what does that miss? God is working a plan. Who does the most in this story to bring about God's plan? It's Rebekah. I'm sure you've heard me say before, if we used a modern metaphor, they're playing a game of football, they get to the 2-yard line, Isaac fumbles the ball. Rebekah picks it up, runs across the goal line, makes a touchdown, flips the ball back to Isaac, and says, we scored, honey, touchdown. In the end, this family did God's will. And Rebekah was able to pull it off without telling off her husband or embarrassing her husband in public, which is a no in that society. But on the surface, you would see selfishness and all these other things, storytelling things. But this last verse, provides that crucial link to the big theme of the seed. Just that one little line where it says, you shall rule over your brothers, be masters over your brother, connects it to Genesis 49, which is the key link at the end of the book, following the seed through the tribe of Judah from there on.